Hi, everyone. In today's Valley of Depth, I'm joined by Tommy Hendrix, a former Green Beret and combat vet who served for a decade in the U.S. military. After multiple deployments, including a pivotal mission to Iraq at the height of the ISIS surge, Tommy made the jump to Wall Street, joining Blackstone before co-founding Decisive Point, a venture firm built to fund and guide the next generation of national security and defense startups. In this conversation, Tommy and I talk about leading soldiers in combat to helping founders navigate government contracts and win real programs. We dive into what's broken in the defense acquisition system, what's improving, and where the most critical technologies need to be developed. Tommy shares what he looks for in a founder, why some military problems aren't venture scale, and how Decisive Point is incubating new companies, including one from a nuclear fuel company's bankruptcy. Let's get started. From September 15th to 19th, three major events come together: World Space Business Week, the Space Defense and Security Summit, and the Space Innovation Summit. It's where the biggest names in space, commercial leaders, startups, defense agencies, and investors meet to shape the future of the industry. Register at WSBW.com or check out nova.space for more details. Tommy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
You worked at Blackstone before Decisive Point. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about Decisive Point. But even more interestingly, you are a former Green Beret, multiple combat deployments. You served in the Army for a decade. How'd you end up in venture?
I think a lot of it had to do with luck. When you transition out of the military, you're counting on a lot of people to take a risk on you. The way I would often tell that person to be able to do the thing that they're wanting to do. So I had the great fortune of a lot of people at Blackstone taking a chance on me, and ended up in a role where I learned a tremendous amount. I was given probably the appropriate level of responsibility for someone who didn't really have a private sector background, but coaching and mentoring, and they really were fantastic. And an organization like that, which really targets top performers and everything they do, I think they understand the value of someone coming out of the military, specifically out of the type of job that I had, and they took that risk in finding a place that I could fit in and add value.
How did you end up deciding to serve in the military?
I was the class before 9/11 in terms of when I was recruiting to go to West Point. I was a recruited wrestler. I had gone through the entire recruitment process, and then in the spring of my senior year in high school, I was not admitted to West Point. So I didn't receive an offer of admission. I was still a recruited athlete, and so I was given the very unique opportunity to go and be a post-grad at a private high school for a year, to continue my wrestling career, to get my grades where they needed to be, and to have a second chance to apply to West Point. So it was really a transformational year for me. Obviously, beyond the wrestling, I met some of my best friends still today. My business partner, Andrew, and I met on 9/11. 9/11 was my first day of class there. And so, pre-9/11, West Point and service academies, they were great places to go to, great resumes. Certainly patriotic people went there to serve. But after 9/11, everything changed, and it was all about getting in the fight, being able to go and deploy forward and serve your country.
Can you? I know you can't talk a lot about the missions itself, but was there any sort of mission or deployment that kind of stays with you in terms of like helping shape, the way you're kind of leading and, building your business now? Like, was there anything you can point to and say like, hey, this was like a really seminal piece of experience that like really shaped the rest of my career?
Yeah, I would say that I had a incredibly fortunate military career. I, over 10 years, never served in any role except in, that of being a small unit leader. So other than the times I was in student status, either going through the Special Forces course or the initial entry training or Ranger School, I was always in command of soldiers. As a combat leader, that's what you want. You want to be in command of soldiers. Soldiers are the ones that do the work, right? When you think about just the incredible patriotism, the will to fight, the will to win. It resides in our soldier and our NCO core across the military. And so when you're a leader, you want to be, closest that you could possibly be to that, ever present, center of power, center of gravity in the military, and that's the soldiers. So I've been in a specialized unit, even as an infantry soldier. I was in a long-range surveillance unit. I went from that to the Special Forces course. I graduated from that and went into Special Forces. I did 3 commands within SF. And my last one, I was the troop commander for the counterterrorism unit that's focused on the Middle East. In 2014, we were the first unit that was called forward to go into Iraq when ISIS was, making their way across the Western Desert towards Baghdad. And there was a lot going on in the country. Up north, ISIS had come through, and we saw kind of all the awful things that were happening up in Tal Afar and Sinjar Mountain and Mosul. And so it was very clear that we were going to need to send troops forward to respond to what was going on, which was both a military crisis, but it was a humanitarian crisis as well. So we went back forward into Iraq. We went to Baghdad, and we had to put the band back together. Probably the most effective foreign internal defense counterterrorism force that had ever been developed was the Iraqi counterterrorism force, the ICTF, and their Tier 1 component, which was called the STU, the Special Tactics Unit. We got to go back in, and we, reunited with these Iraqis that had really grown up from the time they were 16 years old to that point, which was, many of them were in their 30s, with Americans with them all the time. So their entire youth, their formative years, they had been trained, mentored, and fought alongside the Americans. Most of them speak English. And these are real patriots. Their entire families have, for the most part, left Iraq, and they stayed to fight. They stayed to fight for their country. And we were at a point in the conflict where we couldn't go beyond what's called the FLOT, the forward line of troops. So we couldn't actually be there at the edge, at the point of crisis with them. And we had to figure out ways to enable them, to give them the capabilities that we bring to bear that are special to the United States, and that when we're working with a partner force, really enable them to do superhuman things for their own country. And so this was definitely a point of friction where I, as the ground force commander, couldn't be there to do the things that I really wanted to be able to do for them. And so we got creative. We put together what's now called the Remote Advised Assist Kit. At the time, it was just us cobbling together capabilities that we were either buying locally on the economy or piecing together from other pieces of kit. And effectively, we were putting the Iraqis out there, in the fight with ISIS. But we were tracking their locations. We were taking their locations where they thought the enemy was, and we were backplotting it and being able to do what's called a Type 3 cast call, which is where you're not physically there with eyes on. Instead, you're using something like an ISR platform. So every night I would be in a strike cell, watching the fight on the ground, reconciling what I knew, the data we were getting off the sensors, where the Iraqis were, and we were facilitating strikes. And at the time, like this all sounds like stuff that we, of course, should have. To anyone listening that hasn't lived an experience like this might be saying, like, well, yeah, of course we can do that. Well, no, not of course we can do that. This was like something that, again, not me, the soldiers had, really developed this concept, and we had put out and we were testing, and it worked. And so we're able to facilitate, many airstrikes on their behalf, and we got to do what we were able to do best as American advisors. We were able to bring to bear all these capabilities, all this technology that is really decisive in nature to, that finite problem set that the Iraqis on the ground were facing. All the credit, all the heroism goes to them. They're the ones in the fight. They're the ones, facing the danger. And we were there giving them the tools they needed to be able to overwhelm the enemy. And so when we first went on that deployment, I was very much of the of the mind that I needed to be there. We had to be there to make this an effective campaign. And the application of this technology, even though it was in a unconventional application, really educated me that I was able to do everything I wanted to be able to do to support our Iraqi partners, maybe better by not being there. I had 6 TV screens in front of me. I had 2 joint air traffic controllers sitting next to me, and I was able to direct the fight without being on the ground with more clarity of what the problem set was, better situational awareness, and more resources than I probably ever would have been able to do if I was also trying to manage the ground fight as well.
Right. Well, this might be kind of an interesting point to talk a little bit about, the technology. I mean, you're sharing a little bit about the technology that you used on the front line, but I'm sure you've also seen inefficiencies and where areas of where things get broken. I'm curious, and I know that's a lot of what you're spending time on at Decisive Point in terms of investing in these new technologies. Like in your mind, like what's broken and how the U.S. currently fields and procures new defense tech.
Um, well, I would say that from when we started Decisive Point, which is now 7.5 years ago, till today, it's radically different, and it's much better. We're at a point today where you've never seen, in our lifetimes, such a willingness on behalf of the government to work with private industry. The demand pull from government is incredible right now. And so, what I would say is that it's not without fault, right? There's a lot of bureaucracy that has to be overcome, a lot of bureaucracy that has to be navigated. But in terms of getting from pitch deck to program, it's got to be the shortest path it's probably ever been. And so, the problems that we faced on the ground in 2014 and the deployments before that, a lot of it was, we were trying to take these exquisite systems and we were trying to apply them to a low intensity unconventional fight, and that's really hard, right? Like the military is built, not one size fits all, not one tool to solve all problems. You have to have a lot of flexibility, you have to be dynamic to be able to do that. And so, if we take one example, which is unmanned systems, right? The drones that we fought with in Iraq, they're not unmanned, right? They don't have a pilot in it, but there's certainly crews on the ground. There's controllers on the ground. There's pilots on the ground, and then there's people like me who are actually interfacing with the people that are managing that asset to actually put the effects on the ground. So whether it's surveillance or whether it's kinetic strike, someone has to be giving it a direct tasking, right? And so as we think about autonomy today and where we're trying to move with autonomous systems, and many companies have been really successful, I think the government, to its credit, has done a good job of recognizing the urgent need to do this. We're trying to get away from this directive approach where I have to tell it exactly what I want it to do. I have to tell a person how to employ this asset. Instead, we're trying to give intent, right? We want this area to be surveilled. You figure out the best way to do it, and some of that can be offloaded to AI systems. The same is going to eventually be true of strike. We're going to want to say, I am recognizing that there is this threat, this target. I am authorizing it to be dealt with. I do not want to be part of the solution on how it's going to be dealt with. That is going to be, a burden that's placed on either other people or other systems that are not currently actively engaged in ground combat. So, we're going from this, very directive approach in unmanned systems to an intent-based. These are the things that we know we would like to see happen, and then we're going to offload that burden from the soldier to, either other people or other systems to actually have that accomplished.
Do you, and I don't necessarily want to go down this rabbit hole this early on in the conversation, but do you see a future where the human is out of the loop in the kill chain?
I think one step removed, yes. I think if, and again, there's a part of this where we talk about there's always going to be a human. There is yes and no in that um, if we think about the young 18-year-old Marine or soldier that's carrying a heavy machine gun into combat, right? We do rely on them to do target discrimination. But if you think about like from the youngest soldier up to the most experienced, most high-level operator, the thing that really separates them in capability is not their ability to slide down a rope out of a helicopter or jump out of a plane or scuba dive. It comes down to target discrimination. And I'm talking about direct fire ground combat, right? The better you are, the higher the burden that you face related to target discrimination is what really defines how far down the rabbit hole within, let's say, the special operations community is that you are. And so a way that I frame this to people is when you enter a house in combat, you are making a lot of very fast, very small decisions that are leading up to your larger kind of muscle movement actions. And so a good example is when you're clearing a room, you are going to enter the following room, the next hallway from that room with a different posture if there are toys on the floor than if there's bandoliers of AK ammo on the floor. Right? These are the things that humans are really good at. They can percept these things. When we think about applying autonomy, right, like we're a long way away from, a humanoid robot to be able to run up a flight of stairs and do the type of things that a human can do right now and apply the perception, empathy, and the historical perspective that they have, from their own life, their shared experiences, and apply that to responsible and effective target discrimination. But going back to that example of like a young 18-year-old Marine with a 240, can we apply AI to do target discrimination and say, if in this distance, this direction, if this in this bounded area, if there's something with a weapon, it's probably bad. That is the same level of assurance that we have with a Marine. They can only see so far. They can only make the best judgment they can possibly make. And so I think there are some paradigms that we can frame that are going to allow us to offload some of the risk from those young soldiers. And so I would say you can think about it, the closer we get in proximity to the enemy, the harder it is to imagine a world where a human's not going to be in the loop in that decision making. But the further away you get, and the more information you have, and the more situational awareness you have, right? You can imagine, with a linear fight, you have a pretty good sense of where that line is. When you're in a house, you don't know who's good and who's bad until you're looking them in the eye. And so, that's the way I think about it. Do I think we'll have humans in the loop? Yes, but in defining the parameters where force can be applied, less so in, the individual trigger pulls.
Yeah. No, I think that's a fair point. I want to switch gears for a second and talk about the startup ecosystem for a little bit, and obviously the associated investors. Like, tell me a little. Okay, so I in a former life I was an investor, and I remember a very particular story where I brought a deal to committee that was effectively a handgun, but it was a biosensored specific handgun where it would only fire to a specific handprint. And it was one of those things where it was like, hey, clearly this is a good thing to have in American homes. That was sort of my perspective at the time. And the committee sort of perspective at the time was like, we don't invest in that type of thing, right? And like, this is just a microcosm of, I think, what the broader venture community, how the venture community viewed any type of investing in anything that touched national security or defense. What do you think? I guess it's probably easy to kind of extrapolate why investors were historically so reluctant to fund these types of companies. But like, what has changed in your mind? what has, it's become, now it's like, if you're not doing it, there's something you're missing out. You're like, you're not in with the trend. Like, what's changed? I mean, you've obviously, um, been through sort of the arc of the big changes in American national security over the last 20 years. Like, what do you think has changed in the eyes of the venture community?
I think the easy answer to that is always, well, the government got more comfortable, the sales cycle shortened, and people got more comfortable with the investment risk of it. I don't think that's actually it. I think there's two things. One, you had you have some very, very successful examples of companies who defied the odds and have proven that there's an investment thesis here that makes sense. And you can look at Anduril and Palantir and SpaceX, and there's, it's too easy to say, well, those were companies started by billionaires, and they were going to be successful anyway. That's not true, right? The government is a very complex machine, and they had to execute beautifully for it to work, and they did, and it worked. And they had their ups and they had their downs, and they faced their challenges along the way. But they sold this vision to investors that this was a space that they should be in, because it makes good business sense, and because it's an investable space, and because it's the right thing to do, and all those other things that get people committed to any investment idea. The other side of it is, of course, the global war on terror came to its conclusion. As far as the majority of American citizens are concerned. You've probably heard me say, right, this notion of us leaving Afghanistan meant that we were deciding we were done with terrorism, but terrorists aren't necessarily done with us, right? We have to be able to respond to lots of different threats, whether it be in the South China Sea or whether it be, in Iran, like we saw a couple months ago. So we have a lot of responsibilities on the global stage. We have to be able to do a lot, and our departure from these really deeply entrenched nation building type conflicts, I think, freed up a lot of people's willingness and appetite to get more involved in these types of companies. You can't ignore the social and political aspects of it, where it was there were times where the war was very unpopular, which meant investing in the space was very unpopular. And then lastly, I would say, obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has changed a lot of people's minds in terms of, folks that had maybe thought the days of a state-on-state, European conflict like we saw in the last century were behind us. It just shows it's not. We are in a resource-constrained world on the global stage, and conflicts will continue to come up. And I think it was a lesson for a lot of investors. And so the government is a complicated customer, but when you have them as a customer, they're a great customer. They're really sticky contracts. They, of course, have a high willingness to pay. It's the largest technology buyer in the world. And so, I think all those things came together at the right time, and thankfully they did, because, we are reaching a point of greater risk, not less risk. And, for us to put our head in the sand and say, well, these are things we don't invest in, I think fundamentally became no longer an option for most people of conscience.
So, yes, there's the kind of positive outcome of all that is I think quite clear to especially those who are investing in sort of in this area. But there is a byproduct that's occurred, which is valuations have in many cases skyrocketed. They've elevated across every kind of round, every life cycle of the round. And there's a lot of companies and technologies that are getting funded, just from my humble opinion, will never become programs of record. And that comes from a bit of trend following and lack of experience of investing in those areas. How do you underwrite companies within the space? Like what sort of lens do you take in trying to navigate, competitive rounds, term sheets that might seem in certain cases bonkers? Like how do you think about the current kind of market?
Yeah, I mean, and Mo, you know a bit about our model, which I'll just touch on very lightly. That we have a team of folks here who is focused on that bottom up demand signal. Right, we're helping companies navigate the trenches of acquisition. I don't have a board with a half dozen generals that are trying to push from the top down. That's a different value add. And we take the opposite approach. We're trying to be in the very early days, taking the burden of dealing with the government off of companies to the greatest extent that we can. And so what that means is we're looking at companies and we're assessing them on their viability within government, to tap into those pools of capital, because that's our value add. And if we don't see a near-term path for them to tap into those pools of capital, then we're probably not adding a lot of value. So I believe this is inherently a space where you can't just throw money at the problem. You have to add some value because it is so complex. The way that we think about it a lot is, in the same way you never want to be your own lawyer. I never want to see a founder trying to, serve as their own legal counsel. You also probably don't want to be your own government contracting officer, and that's the role that we fill for most of our companies. And so we spend a lot of time looking at the federal budget. We have passed on lots of companies, and some of them turned out to be great. We've passed on lots of companies because we are looking at the budget and saying we're not seeing the movement within the government to fund programs in this area. And by the way, not every company needs to become a program of record, but there has to be a budget and mandate held by some program that says we're going to fund this thing, this technology area. And if there's not, you can have some holes in that value chain across government, which is like end user, the command, the program, the authorizer in Congress and the appropriator in Congress. You can have a couple holes, but you can't have none of those things lined up on day one. You have to be able to see that there is some path for you. And so, over the years, the way we've refined our focus areas, and it's been consistent, really, the focus areas, but what we're looking for in the companies, I think, has become more refined, is they're either government first or the government is their primary customer. And that covers a lot of the pure defense investments that we have. The second bucket is companies where the commercial market is nascent today, but the government continues to fund it because there's some strategic importance for that technology area, right? So quantum computing and those types of technologies are a good example of that, right? They haven't quite found their big commercial market footing yet. The government continues to pour money into it because we know strategically in the long term it's going to be really important. And then the third is technology areas where the commercial market is their ultimate end goal, where they're going to make most of their revenue, but there's some regulatory barrier that makes it hard for them to ever reach that market without successfully navigating the government. And so nuclear is a really good example of that. Most of these companies in nuclear are going to be commercial successes, but if they don't navigate regulation and contracting and all the things that are very difficult about getting a new highly regulated product to market, they'll never make it to that commercial angle.
Let's talk a little bit about that. Tell us a little bit about the work you're doing in nuclear, and we can maybe kind of think about some of that and regulatory navigation through that lens.
Sure. So, we made our first nuclear investment about 3.5 years ago. We participated in Radiance Series A. At the time, it was a very small team, just starting out. But we were interested in the space, and just like I was saying before, we were following the cues of the government. The government had launched Project Pele. The Army had said we want a nuclear reactor program for terrestrial applications. It was going to be a small modular reactor. And so we started following that trend in that market closely. And, I read about Radiant in a journal, and I reached out to Doug, and that's how we got involved there. Admitting that I don't know that much at the time about the Department of Energy and what their, process was going to look like. But that, the majority of federal acquisitions does have a lot of common threads, and we were going to be able to help them as they navigate the government. Doug and Bob at the time, they had come out of SpaceX. They knew the value of being able to successfully and effectively navigate regulation, navigate the government. And so it was a good value add for them. And so, we got involved there, and we learned a ton as we went through a lot of the pre-licensing activities with them. And then along the way, we saw there were other areas in the market that needed attention. So a lot of other great reactor companies have come online. We think really highly of a lot of them. Obviously, we had made our bet on a reactor company, but I think there's a half dozen of other really good and very credible developers out there. So we believe in it in this sector at large, that there's going to be a number of reactors that successfully go through demonstration and licensing. But what we started to see was there was this bottleneck on fuel. And so a little over a year ago, we formed a company that was intended to be an incubation to make a nuclear fuel fabrication company, modeled after actually a company called Ultra Safe Nuclear. And a couple months into that process, we actually got some outreach from another nuclear company letting us know that Ultra Safe was going into bankruptcy. It's a really fascinating story. It had been funded almost solely by one gentleman, Richard Helms, who had been a CIA case officer, back in the 80s and the 90s. He passed away, and the company got into a distressed situation. And of course, pretty non-standard for a venture capital firm to get into a Chapter 11 bankruptcy process, but we jumped in. We went through the entire process as a stalking horse bidder, and we bought the assets for their fuel fabrication facilities, all their IP, and we retained the personnel that we needed to stand up, an independent fuel fabrication company, and it's called Standard Nuclear today.
Has that experience given you sort of a new kind of lens as towards Decisive Point strategy, like investment strategy as a whole? Was this a one-off, I guess is what I'm saying?
It's given me a tremendous amount of empathy for founders, because I had to go through the pitch process, the capital raising process. I had to get in front of investors. I have to deal with, other VCs in a capacity that's different than being a co-investor. I think that we're eventually going to see this natural, at a minimum, intersection of venture capital and private equity, more traditional finance. We're seeing lots of VCs way into that space. We're seeing some startups emerge that really look and sound like private equity plays. Like they're doing roll-ups. They're looking at obsolescence issues, industries that have been ignored and forgotten, and trying to reestablish traditional manufacturing. I think it's a great signal nationally that people are getting interested in that space. And when you talk about it, everyone is on this hype train of like build things, right? These factories, these very unsexy businesses are great at building things. And if we can inject some of the fire that you get coming out of the more traditional tech community into those businesses, I think it's a really interesting combination. And that's what we're seeing with Standard. So are we going to do more deals like that? I don't know how many more bankruptcies will be the right fit, but definitely incubations. This is our second incubation. Obviously, lots of other VCs have done incubations before, and I think especially when you've spent the amount of time in a specific sector that like really focused VCs do, you see the holes, you see the gaps, you see the consistent demand signal coming from the customer for things that maybe don't exist. And so you have to weigh if you're the right person to solve that problem. But when you are, or if you think you can assemble the right team to do it, it's definitely a bet that I would expect to see us take.
How do you I'd be curious, how do you make decisions at the firm level? Like, what is the process, what does the committee process look like at Decisive Point?
Yeah, I mean, because we have this like very broad called portfolio operations mandate, where we're helping companies and we're advising companies, we're running programming for organizations like DIU. Everyone on the team, regardless of how much time they're really spending focused on you know the numbers related to making a venture investment, have a lot of value to add. And so they know more about where a company might be or where a program is at or what's getting appropriated funding for a specific technology area than say I do if I'm just looking at pitch decks and having calls with companies. So what we do is we discuss all these companies, all these opportunities very openly on the team. I want to hear the back and forth. We want someone kind of coming in out of left field and saying, actually I just heard from this other thing that I'm doing or this other company I'm working with that this program is looking for this capability or this congressional member is advocating for this thing in appropriations. All of that is really informative to what I was discussing before of making sure that there is the mandate, the pull, and the budget from the government for a technology area. So we get the immense benefit of having like a multidisciplinary team all looking at the same sector and being able to weigh in with their opinions on it, whether it's their opinions in terms of the technology or the investor base that is participating in the deal, or the actual mechanics of the contracts that the company has. We spend a lot of time looking at that stuff in due diligence. We thrash out those types of things in an open weekly meeting. And then by the time things are ready to get to an investment decision, we again have that discussion openly in investment committee. So we don't retreat to a smaller group for investment committee, right? Everyone on the team gets to hear how we make decisions, how we have a rigorous process for poking holes in business models or deals, and getting to consensus. And so I would say that all of our deals are largely made with the partnership in concurrence that this is the right deal for us.
Have you ever come across a company that you felt like was ultimately good for the nation, but you just saw it was difficult to scale? It was a piece of technology that ultimately was good and it could be impactful, but just like it was not going to be something where you could really justify a venture like return.
Yeah, I think where we see that a lot is, and this is maybe like a more general statement. A lot of people look at the special operations community and they think this is a great entry point because it's the validation you get from working with SOF. It is I think at a minimum the assumption that they can move faster, that they can make decisions more quickly, and that they have budget. All those things are true in a sense, but you can think about SOF as it's a very small customer within the military. It has a high willingness to pay to solve a very small subset of problems. So is it where you scale your product to hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue? Probably not. For the most part, it's they need small quantities of something that are going to solve a really finite problem for them. And so we see stuff like that all the time. Things that I say, I am intimately familiar with the problem you're solving, and unfortunately, it's just not that big of a problem for in terms of venture scale. It's a big problem for this very narrow customer set, and you should pursue it. And you should go do it. But because what you're doing is so impactful for that very small population, it's probably a business that you probably don't need to raise a ton of money. You can just go get revenue and just be a government contracting business that solves this problem. That's not what a lot of founders want to hear sometimes, right? They want to, know how they're going to run the, round after round after round, and get to a big scale. But for some technologies, that's not the path.
Yeah. If Well, okay. So broader question, right? You mentioned that now. You mentioned earlier that now is one of the best times to be seeing this type of interest in capital, and then interest in founders wanting to build, because our risk from adversaries hasn't been, as great in a very long time. Um, what are If the U.S. wants to maintain its edge, what are technologies that you view as like a must win, no matter the cost?
Yeah, I mean, we are, make no question, we're in an AI race for sure, and it's not. If you look at that statement, there's so much to unpack there. It's not just a race in creating the best models. Like it's the race in the compute. It's the race in the power. So energy is a component of it. Like this is a Manhattan Project level of importance race that we're in right now, and it's for AI. Everything that we apply on the battlefield at some point in the future, um, there will likely be an AI component of it, and so that I think has to be priority number one. And you think about all the things that have been funded, all the innovations that have made it to to the Department of Defense as they've gotten more open to working with the government, and as the investment and technology community has become more open with working in the government themselves. Um, what are the first things that are going to just be completely discarded and not be of importance if the balloon went up tomorrow, right? I don't know how many VR headsets we need to train pilots. And that's not taking a shot at any of the companies that have been building these simulators. There's probably one winner in that space, and we trained pilots really well for decades before without that. That's that's not the meat. That's not the really important stuff. Um, we're looking for what are those deterrent level technologies, the things that are going to allow us to resupply more effectively, have more resources, have more power, and bring more you know um, actually kinetic force to the fight. And those are, once you start like really drilling back and say, why is this really going to be important if we needed it tomorrow? Um, there's actually not that many things that should we should feel like the panic that we need more of it. We need more investment into it. Those are the things that we're looking for. Like where when you see it, do you almost feel like panic that we haven't built it fast enough and we don't have enough of it?
Well, let's to kind of touch on that theme. What are the types of companies, startup ideas that when you hear you're just like, oh, not another one of these. Like, I don't need another GPS denied drone system, versus like, hey, like we need to see more founders building here because these are areas where we see gaps.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to shoot too many holes in like too many specific areas of focus, because the answer is like we need builders in all these things, and the cream's going to rise to the top, and you never know exactly what you're going to need. But a good example is in the last couple of years, everyone's become really fixated in the small drone market, right? Um, but I often think like, well, why did Ukrainians start using FPV drones? Was it because FPV drones are the best thing for anti armor? It's like, well, not really. It's because they wanted javelins. We only have a finite number of javelins, and in the absence of javelins, they needed something else that could deliver an anti armor round precisely onto a target from a sufficient range away that's going to keep them out of the minimum safe distance of those small arms. Um, and drones were a low cost, readily available solution for that, which they have employed both sides with devastating effect. So this is in no way to diminish the efficacy of that tactic or that capability. But what did they really want? They wanted javelins, right? And I think for most people, if you had a Russian tank bearing down on you, and I said you could either have this FPV headset and drone, or you can have this javelin. They're taking the javelin every single time. And so, basically, there's a place in the modern battlefield for small FPV drones. This will become ubiquitous on every fight that we ever face moving forward for the foreseeable future. It is going to be a part of our, uh, national security footing here at home. The fact that we haven't seen drone attacks on, for terrorist operations here in the United States, and I'm not like giving anyone ideas, they already have these ideas. The fact that we haven't seen it is to our amazing fortune that hasn't happened. They're very hard to defend against. They're commodity items. You can buy them off Amazon, and they're really effective. And so, basically, we're going to need it all. But if you were talking about like for deterring a peer adversary, I want to see those, more, exquisite weapon systems also being invested into. So it's just an example of like the market chasing the tail of the conflict, where everyone got really fixated on this thing, and there was a lot of movement, a lot of companies that stood up to solve that problem, and some of them are amazing, and they're going to be really successful companies. I look at like companies like Neuros, like amazing what they've done. Their partnership with Kraken Kinetics, which is like, should be like a case study for, people that want to build in defense, like real operator know-how, real expertise, and solving a really like finite problem at the edge. What a great case study. But where the innovation dollars need to keep going is not chasing that tail, but like looking where the puck is going, not where the puck's at now.
Yeah, no, I think no, that makes sense. Are you? So are you guys? What's the earliest that you'll invest?
An idea.
Okay, so then, well, we didn't really get a chance to chat about this, but the founder, when it comes to investing in a company, like if you're kind of weighting sort of the idea versus like readiness for the government, however you want to describe sort of like their ability to take the product into the hands of the government versus just like founder attributes, like how do you kind of weight those three things in your mind? Like what are or I mean I don't want to hold you to those three things, but what are the things that you're particularly focused on, and what are the qualities you want to see in a founder that makes you like want to lean in?
Yeah, I mean, I don't need a founder to know the inner workings of the government and be able to, walk the halls of the Pentagon like a pro. There's lots of people that know how to do that, and lots of people who know how to do that who want to be in this sector. So you got to find the founder out there that has, the go behind them, that is going to aggressively pursue, what they're building. And it's hard to ignore the network effect of being around other great founders or coming from a company where you've gotten to see it done well before. And so there's that mix of, technical acumen, experience as a builder, and then, just that, indefinable characteristic of, they have an extra gear that a normal person doesn't have, and they're gonna make this thing happen. They're gonna will it into existence if that's what it takes. And it's hard to know after just a couple phone calls. We like to get in person. We like to go and like meet the founders personally before we invest. But sometimes you can get that sense that this is a person who has a really unique background that makes them just fundamentally the right person to solve this problem, and then they have the right network backing, and the personality that's going to make it possible.
What's a belief or principle that you carried from the military into your investing career?
I mean, I talked about it a little bit at the beginning when I was talking about the soldiers, right? Like, um, I think team's really important, and you surround yourself with good, smart people, and that have a shared mission and a shared vision, and that's about the best you can do to set yourself up for success. No one person is going to be able to carry an organization, to any heights of any meaning. So, whether it's a company we're investing in or Decisive Point itself, I look at just finding the right people and giving them the opportunity to, pick up the ball and run with it however we need them to. And I'll give you a very, brief example. Our very first employee here at Decisive Point is a person named Debbie. Debbie joined us when it was just kind of a couple folks with an idea. We didn't have a fund yet, and she filled every role, everything we asked her ever to do. And just very organically, she started to assume more and more responsibility for me in fund administration, investor relations. And now I would say Debbie certainly knows a lot more than I do about, our audit process, our fund admin process, doing distributions, filling out the forms for taxes every year. I mean, she could go and work at any VC or any hedge fund, and it's all, mostly self-taught. Debbie got promoted to partner this year. And so, over the course of 5.5 years, this is someone who just joined because she was all in on the mission and grew into exactly what we needed her to be. And if you had asked me 5 years ago what I would need from Debbie in 5 years, I would have told you I have no idea. And so, it was just hiring an athlete that knew that there was work to be done and was willing to do whatever that work was to make the organization successful.
Hopefully Debbie is a code name or an alias so people don't try and poach her.
Yeah. Good luck.
So I just to close here, Tommy, my last question is like, and it probably cuts to your story about Debbie, but like, what's the mission at Decisive Point for everyone that comes into work every day? Like, what ultimately drives you guys forward and want to come in and be excited for the work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about myself personally. Leaving the military is bittersweet. You can't help but have some like survivor guilt when you leave, and I mean that not in the purest sense of the form, but sometimes it is. But that you're leaving, in my case, the team behind, the guys behind to go on the next deployment without you, to stay in the fight and keep doing the mission. And so, I often think about, would they still be proud of, of me doing the work I am now, as I believe they were when we were, in it together. So that, I think that's a big part of it for me, is that I have an obligation to the people that continue to serve and the people that are signing up today and, for the next 20 years and raising their hand and, swearing that oath to the flag and continuing to fight, to make sure that we're doing everything we can, and that, we're living a life of purpose when it comes to, our own service. I have two sons and a daughter, and I would really like them not to have to go fight a war of liberation somewhere else on some other land. And so to the extent that we can ensure that we're developing the deterrence capabilities to make sure that, they don't have that obligation, they don't have that duty, I think is really important to me.
Yeah, well said. Tommy, thanks for being on the show. It was great to have you. It looks like your next call's beeping. So appreciate you spending time with us, and looking forward to having you back on the show in the future.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark. And congrats on all the success.
Thank you. And you've been a big supporter of us, so I always appreciate that. So until next time.